such an important because it's an important part of who we are. When we were born many years ago inside of our mother's stomach, we were attached by an umbilical cord, and it provided us with nourishment, food, air, and water. When we were born, part of that umbilical cord is taken and given to the mother, and she would take it back to her community and plant it in a sacred area. And as we got to the age of 12 and 13, they call it the wandering and wondering years. And our parents would remind us, or our mother would remind us where we had come from, our connection to the land. So the Nipissings here do not own the land. We are the keepers of the land. We look after it. And again, when I talk to our youth at our summer camps, I always say that there's one person that we should never disrespect, and that is our mother, and also Mother Earth. We need to respect her. So when we came into each other's territories years ago, so let's say if the Algonquins came into our territory, they'd lay that tobacco down and say, we are in the traditional territories of Nipissing First Nation, and they are the keepers of the land. So it was that land acknowledgement um, that each other had. And it also reminds us of our own history, of the 500 years of colonization, and it just acknowledges that we do have a history here. And when Indigenous people hear that land acknowledgement, it finally tells us that we're still here and that people are acknowledging us, um, and it makes us feel good. So that's why that land acknowledgement, you'll hear that all the time now. And there's a radio station in North Bay here. They talk about that land acknowledgement every morning. Miigwech?
Miigwech, George. I feel like we both should be on the camera here. I'm not exactly sure what to do with both of us being side by side. I'm not used to being beside somebody anymore, so this is really nice. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Maybe. So George and I were talking a little bit before today and over the weekend, and we thought it'd be important to speak about how traumatic it has been for Indigenous communities with the ongoing uncoverings of Indigenous children in the areas where residential schools were located. And I do have to admit, it's been difficult to think about hosting a session like this during this time. It's been heavy on my mind over the last week, over the last month, and over the weekend. And I recognize that it's going to be a challenging time for us today, many of us in the audience, myself and George included. But we are coming together today to learn, to unlearn, and to understand how some of the complex history of colonialism in Canada, and perhaps we can leave with some new perspectives to understand what is happening and what is going to continue to happen over the next while Indigenous communities uncover and mourn and bring their children home. So by coming here today, you are expressing support for Indigenous communities, and you're doing this by showing up and listening and being open, and by deepening your learning and understandings of the history and the current situations and the traditional territories that will be shared today. So we will by no means have time to cover everything that we would like to share, but we hope within the next 3 hours, we will share some new understandings for you to carry forward with you. So much of the information today will be upsetting. You might feel guilty for not knowing, you might cry, you might be confused as to how this could have happened. You might feel some anger and disbelief, and all of these feelings are okay. I've had all of these feelings and thoughts, and I continue to feel them. And I've learned that it is important to have these feelings, but acting on your feelings in a kind way is also very important. So I'm going to ask you to go easy on yourself as you learn and unlearn and reflect, and to be kind to others and respect where they are at in their learning or unlearning journeys. And then continue to support Indigenous communities by showing up and supporting what they are asking you to do. To listen to the elders, listen to the parents and the children, and act on what they are asking. Not what you think needs to be done, but what they are asking to be done. So it is our hope that you feel like you're in a safe place today to learn and unlearn. We are also sharing the residential school survivor support line here. It's available to support survivors and their families. And I'd like to say miigwech for listening. So looking at today's agenda, today we are here to celebrate summer and the ways of doing and food as a pathway. So my friend George here is from Nipissing First Nation, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I met George. The first time I met him, he was speaking when I worked at Nipissing University, and we all had a privilege of sitting in a circle with him that day. And though we're on a Zoom webinar today, I do invite you to envision yourself as all of us being in a big circle. You have someone sitting on both sides of you, and I hope you feel comfortable as we are here today. So as we engage in this journey, you're going to hear various terms referring to Indigenous peoples. So terms that continue to change and evolve, that can include Aboriginal, Native, Indian, First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous. So Indigenous is a term that is widely used today. It's a blanket term that includes First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people that are living in Canada. However, the term conceals the reality that there are hundreds of distinct Indigenous communities with each their own unique history, culture, and traditions and economies. And there's not just one Indigenous culture. Also, Indigenous communities that live across Turtle Island have distinct beliefs and practices around food, and these include different protocols and different ceremonies. So our goal is to invite you into a deeper awareness and with the Indigenous peoples of your region, so you can advance your reconciliation journey in a culturally sensitive and mindful way. So I just want to talk a little bit more about how I have come to know George. So during that day, he shared stories and teachings, and specifically his turtle teaching, which he's kindly offered to share today. So this teaching actually changed my outlook and how I treat myself. And when I make mistakes or when something not so great happens to me, or if I'm feeling sad or down, George referenced the turtle, and it really helps me focus on the present while not forgetting the past and not spending too much on the future. So I won't spoil his teaching, but I just want to say it's a very important learning experience for me. So George and I met again years later on the cross trainer at the gym, and I knew who he was. And I knew that some of my friends were going through some hard times with mental health with regards specifically to PTSD. And as I think back to that day we sat in a circle at Nipissing University, I asked George if he had ever visited a fire hall or a police station to sit in a circle to offer the teachings to the folks. And we did have a very long conversation, but the short of the story is yes. And he shared with me that he was working with hospitals to sit with healthcare staff and deliver cultural mindfulness training. So then he invited me to a meeting after that. And I'm really thankful that we did meet and that we did have this conversation, because ever since then, George and I have been working together on cultural mindfulness. And I'd like to expand a little bit more, because I do believe that sharing cultural mindfulness within healthcare to be very critical, not only for healthcare teams and professionals to understand, but for you to also have a good understanding of how you can support the Indigenous patients and families that come to see you for treatments, surgeries, and appointments. Understanding that historically these institutions have been used as a place to inflict pain and trauma to Indigenous people, and how this does continue today, and how you can stop this cycle by listening to advice and knowledge shared by Indigenous communities nationally. And that's what Food is Our Medicine has woven together for you. We put this together with an Indigenous-led community advisors. It includes elements of the past, present, and future, with resources that were created by Indigenous communities to guide you on a path to reconciliation with the best intentions possible. The reasoning is that once we know how we got here, we can understand how to move forward, and food can be one pathway for reconciliation. It brings us together no matter where we are or where we're from, and it's a language of love and caring. So I'm just going to share a little bit about Food is Our Medicine for those who just have signed up or might not know much about it. It's an action learning series, and what action learning does is it aims to solve problems and develop leaders simultaneously because it encourages participants to think critically and work collaboratively. So it's said to be particularly effective for solving complex problems that might appear unsolvable. It elevates the norms, the collaboration, the creativity, and the courage of groups. So Food is Our Medicine was designed to introduce healthcare professionals and leaders to new and different ways of understanding the complex relationships between Indigenous foodways, reconciliation, healing, and healthcare. So this series includes a learning journey, which you see on the left, and a digital resource bundle, or a digital bundle that can be found on our website. Food is Our Medicine is a 4-part reflective, self-paced learning journey that takes approximately 15 hours to complete. Each learning journey is placed within season, and it contains 4 teachings, beginning with fall and leading through winter, spring, and summer. Participating in the learning journey gives you access to learning materials, as well as an online community space, which is what we're doing today. You can connect with others embarking on the journey here, and all of this is available at no cost. So the modules begin with fall, seeing the pathway and how food is culture. It introduces two-eyed seeing and systems thinking. It situates yourself within the work and on the land, and looking at the impacts of colonization on the healthcare experience and the impact it had on Indigenous foodways in Canada. Then you go through winter, ways of relating and how food is relationships, where you are presented with the relational aspects of food and foodways. It guides you towards reconciliation in healthcare and understanding and supporting cultural mindfulness in healthcare. After winter comes spring, coming to know food is healing. We share examples of traditional food guides, stories, and teachings, and you will be exploring and celebrating the diversity of Indigenous foodways here. You will see highlights of self-determination and examples of community-driven responses to COVID-19. And the last part of the journey is summer, ways of doing, and it shares how food is a pathway by discussing current barriers to Indigenous foods in healthcare, highlighting existing traditional food programs in healthcare and healthcare settings, and sharing examples of policies and tools. It also offers options for next steps. And before I hand it over to George, I'd like to share one more connection, and that George's cultural mindfulness film is included in the fall learning journey. And I did have the opportunity to work with him on this film and other projects to support the good work that he does across Ontario and now nationally. There will be time for questions and answers after George shares his first part. So if you have any questions along the way, please drop them in the chat, or you can also put them in the questions part. And we will, if we don't have time to get to them, we will follow up with you after. And if you do need to step away or take a break, please do so. And I would also like to ask, if you haven't done so already, if you could share your name and where you're from and your favorite summer food in the chat. And now I'm going to pass it over to George.
Miigwech again, Myra. So I was a police officer for 33 years. I then was with North Bay City Police for 9 years. Then I went over to Nipissing First Nation. And then while I was at Nipissing First Nation, Ipperwash happened, and I was sent down to Ipperwash to sit in the trial for 11 weeks. And shortly then I was sent back home. And then the OPP asked me if I would be interested in teaching about Native history and culture, and we called it the Native Awareness course, and we probably put 6,000 officers through that training. And shortly after that, I went back to the Nishnabe Police Service, and then the OPP asked me to join them. And I was there until 2015, and then I retired. And now I go around teaching about Native history, culture, the effects of residential schools. And I know Myra already talked about the different names people call us. When I was, my father was a residential school survivor, and he talked, when he was at residential school, they used to call them savages. Then when I went to school, they would call us Indians. When I became a police officer, then they started to call us First Nations. And then they used to call us Aboriginal. And when they started to call us Aboriginal, the community of Nipissing came out and said, "We are Nishnabe people." And the OPP called me in and said, "Listen, we changed all the letterhead. Now the community has called themselves Nishnabe. What do they want us to call them?" And I said, "Maybe we should start to ask." And I always tell people, don't get so caught up in all the different words. In our communities, we don't call ourselves Indigenous, we call ourselves Nishnabe people. And so you have to go to the community that you're working with. There's really not one time where you need to classify a group of people. But if you needed to, then I would go to that community. So just in the news in the last while, we've seen the numbers of children at the residential school, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the numbers of deaths and how it's impacted people. And shortly after the numbers came out, I got a call from the bishop, uh, and we talked, and I got a call from doctors and a couple of lawyers, and I think people are feeling a lot of trauma. And I remind people too about trauma. Trauma isn't just about the bad things that have happened to you, but also the good things that didn't happen to you. And I know that as people were going through, that um, either we're sad or we're upset about it. But I always remind people, how uncomfortable we're feeling. Imagine how those young kids felt that never got to go home, or their parents that never got to see their children either. So we're going to watch a couple of short videos, um, and it's just the news that we see on TV every so often.
For Indigenous communities, the impact of COVID is complicated by systemic racism in healthcare. CTV's Creason Ajgute on the government's latest legislative promise to tackle the prejudice.
For the first time, Ottawa is taking steps to eliminate Indigenous racism within Canada's healthcare system.
Can no longer remain idle in front of this flagrant infringement of human rights and on basic Canadian values.
Joyce Echaquan's story is why changes may be coming. The 37-year-old died shortly after recording herself as nursing staff in Quebec made racist insults towards her. The federal government says it will develop Indigenous health legislation with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit partners.
I think it's another opportunity to look at fixing a healthcare system that's broken when it comes to First Nations people.
A system that was broken for Sheila North's mother. A Manitoba doctor assumed the Cree elder used alcohol when she was having difficulty getting up while she was suffering from cellulitis on her leg.
One of the comments was, you can't drink while you have diabetes, and I can say with 100% certainty my mother has never drank a drop of alcohol in her entire life.
And in BC, an investigation was launched after allegations emergency staff were playing a game where they would guess the blood alcohol level of Indigenous patients.
Medical bylaws are under review by the ministry to ensure consistent standards for cultural safety and humility as an expectation of medical staff privileges.
But this doctor remains skeptical that a new federal law can make a difference.
For me, I don't see how this legislation deals with the systemic provincial and territorial health system racist incidents that people continue to experience.
$15.6 million will be committed by the federal government over 2 years to help with the consultation process, but there is no timeline as to when this legislation will be put into place. Lisa?
Okay, so still a lot of questions. Thanks for this, Creason. For Indigenous communities, the impact of
Just trying to get it to the next one. Bear with me for one
COVID
second.
is
Get out of here. There we go.
For Indigenous communities, the impact of COVID is complicated.
We audited Indigenous Services Canada's support to ensure that First Nations communities have reliable access to safe drinking water. Despite committing to do so by March 2021, Indigenous Services Canada did not meet the government's commitment to remove all long-term drinking water advisories for public systems in First Nations communities. Drinking water advisories have remained a constant in many communities, with almost half outstanding for more than 10 years. In some cases, advisories were lifted as a result of interim measures that did not fully address underlying deficiencies. I am very concerned and honestly disheartened that this long-standing issue is still not resolved. Access to safe drinking water is a basic human necessity. I don't believe anyone would say that this is in any way an acceptable situation in Canada in 2021. Indigenous Services Canada must work in partnership with First Nations to develop and implement a lasting solution for safe drinking water in First Nations communities. We audited Indigenous Services Canada's support to
Yeah, go to the next one. That was a video.
Oh, this one's the video?
Oh, so we're going to talk about connection. And for Indigenous people, our connection is Mother Earth. So everything, how we survived off the land for thousands of years was our connection. And so we are the keepers of Mother Earth. So any disease that there is, there's a cure on Mother Earth, and we just need to find that cure. So from the Earth comes our culture, and so what is our connection? And we talked about food, music, all these different things are connection, and from that culture comes our beliefs, and from our beliefs come our values, and from our values come our attitudes, and from our attitudes come our behaviors. And a lot of times we only see the tip of the iceberg, the behaviors of Indigenous people. When I work with Indigenous youth at our summer camps, I always say that we're first in line when no one wants to be first, and we're last in line when no one wants to be last. We have the highest rates of suicide for a minority in the whole world. We have the highest rates of obesity. We have the highest rates of AIDS, homelessness rates. We are at the top of that also. When you go to the city of Toronto, 25% of the homelessness people are Indigenous. We make up 3.9% of the population of Canada, and we make up almost 28% of the federal prisons. Women actually make up a little higher of the number of people in the federal prisons. In the provincial jails out west, we make up 70 to 80%. Indigenous youth almost make up 50% of the children in care. And so you see that a lot of times, like on the news or newspapers, and there's really not one time where you can't see Indigenous people either we're dying, dead, or we're complaining. And so again, a lot of times people only see our behaviors. So a few years ago, when I was a young man, I was probably in grade 3, and I went to a Catholic school in North Bay, and I met a young man named Freddie. And Freddie was Indigenous also. We became really good friends. He was a little bigger than I was. And Freddie would come out to our house. He'd walk 3 miles out to the Nipissing First Nation community. and we'd play hockey and baseball. The next year when school started, Freddie wasn't at school. And Freddie had told me that he lived in foster care and that his mother had passed away. And it wasn't for a few years later that I met Freddie again. And this time it was in court when I became a police officer. Freddie had already been to prison. And on his, before they'd sentence him again, they did a sentencing pre-report, and it talked about Freddie's history. Freddie's father was very violent, would go into fits of rage. And on a Christmas Eve, Freddie and his two brothers were watching TV, and the father brought the mother out into the living room and stabbed her some 30 times. Freddie's two older brothers actually died from alcohol poisoning, and Freddie had been to prison a couple of times. As soon as I heard that, I started to realize what Freddie's story is. And a few years later, when I was in a northern community doing a talk, and at the end of the talk, they presented me with this wooden eagle feather and these two little wooden paddles. And I'd asked him who did these, and he said that a person named Freddie. And I met Freddie a few years later in North Bay, and we talked about different things and how we were young people. And again, about that circle in life, we meet those people. So even the history that we talk about in the United States, up until 1905, you can get $5 for an Indian scalp. And again, people saw Indigenous people as less than human. And you'll see how that unfolds in our history. So this is the map of North America. We call it Turtle Island. And there's approximately 500 nations of people that live on Turtle Island. And they speak over 365 different languages. My father said this was like Europe. He said different nations of people, different languages, different culture. They're not all the same, he'd said. And for the Nipissings, we had a large area. Our hunting area went from Oka right over to Nipigon, north of Toronto, and right up to the James Bay coast. And he said we warred against each other. We had allies. He said we would trade with the Inuit and to the Haudenosaunee in the south. So first contact, there was approximately 25 million people in North America. And I was watching PBS, the American channel, and they said there was as many as 125 million people in North America. 3 to 4 million Indigenous people lived in Canada prior to the to the Europeans coming. In 1960, they say there was 600,000 status people left. They were highly developed by relationships, linked by politics, trade, and economics. So when the Europeans come, they bring things that they don't know that they're bringing, diseases, and it wipes out 60 to 90% of the communities. Some communities on the east coast of Canada and the United States were totally wiped out by these diseases. So when we look at the map here, we see the different diseases across Turtle Island, smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis is still a huge problem in the far north. Measles and smallpox actually comes twice in this area, once through European-born diseases and another time through germ warfare. When we talk about germ warfare, the British would use blankets out of hospitals and trade them with the Indigenous people, the people that were sick, and it spread the diseases throughout our communities. So land issues. So now when the Europeans come, we call them friendship treaties. They said, oh, we just want a little piece of land. We're not going to bother anyone. Then after a while, big chunks of land were taken. And the Royal Proclamation actually was started by the government saying, okay, you can't directly buy land off the Indigenous people, you have to buy land off of us. So they became the owners of the land. Mining happens in 1830. In this area here, there was mining gold, silver, and in this area here, W.H. Robinson was sent in to negotiate with the Ojibwe. And so in the treaties, how they worked, they would say, okay, we're going to take your land. We'll give you health care. So they promised us health care, and they called it a medical chest. They also said, we'll also give you schooling. So in 1850, we got our first school in 1999. And so a lot of these things that were promised under the treaties, they never expected Indigenous people to survive. They thought we were going to die in huge numbers. And so they would also say, okay, we're going to give you money. So they would give us $4 for treaty payments in the Robinson Huron. And every year they would come back to our community and they would give us $4. And they were still doing that last year. So the bands that were in the Huron Robinson took the federal government and the provincial government to court, saying, when we signed these treaties, it was to share resources. And for $4, we haven't been given our fair share. So when you look at the, just like in Sudbury, the Inco that has been taking the nickel out of the mine, it's probably been billions of dollars, and same as the Hudson Bay Company, how much money they made on the far north also. So they called Indigenous people the vanishing race because we were dying in huge numbers. One of the things said we don't even have to fight them anymore, we just breathe on them. So there was a fellow named Edward S. Curtis, and he was hired by the United States government to take as many pictures as possible of Indigenous people before they vanished. And actually, he came to the Western Canada and also took pictures of the Indigenous people. He has several books out, and I've own a few of them. And there's some beautiful pictures of Indigenous people. Again, they call us the vanishing race because we're going to die in huge numbers. So the British North American Act was signed in 1867, and this was going to be responsible for Indians and the lands reserved for Indians. And what the British North American Act stated that Indigenous people were incompetent to look after themselves, so they became wards of the state. And so wards of the state means you're incompetent. We still have wards of the state now with Children's Aid. And so they were seen as children under the Great White Father. So John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, his aim was to get away, to assimilate Indigenous people as quickly as possible. And because they wanted to clear the land of the Indigenous people. So Indigenous people were prohibited from voting until 1954, and in the federal election until 1960. So I had uncles that had gone to the First and Second World War. Some of them spilled their blood for Canada, and when they fought for the freedom of Canada. But when they returned home, they did not have that freedom. They didn't have the freedom to vote under the voting until 1960. So the Indian Act started in 1876, and it was going to regulate and manage band councils, reserve memberships, and this was only going to be temporary until everyone was assimilated. So under the Indian Act, it said who or wasn't an Indian. So let's say there was some Scots and Irishmen and Frenchmen living in First Nation communities. And so when the Indian agents went into these communities and they saw the Scots and Irishmen living with the Indigenous people, they say, well, if you're crazy enough to live here, you're Indian also. And some of the Indigenous people that weren't in their traditional territories were out hunting lost their status. So a Native man, under the eyes of the law, marries a Native woman. They're both seen as incompetent, so their child is incompetent, so their child still needs the great white father, so they receive status. So a Native man marries a non-Native woman. So under the eyes of the law, non-Native women didn't get the right to vote until 1919. And prior to that, they were seen as property of their father or their brothers. And so they were seen as incompetent also. So they said if an incompetent woman marries an incompetent man, which is an Indigenous man, their children will have status. So let's say a Native woman marries a non-Native man. So she is seen as incompetent, but when she marries a non-Native man, he can have a job, he can go to university. So they say that she loses her status and that she has the great white hope to look after her. And this is in law until 1982 in Canada. Reserve lands, they would put them in areas that the land wasn't very good, swampy areas or away from other communities. Cultural, social, and religious practices against the law. You could be charged for wearing your regalia without the government permission. Under the Indian conspiracy law of 1880, Indigenous people could not gather more than 3 people because they were afraid that they were going to challenge the government, so they couldn't gather more than 3 people in some areas. They weren't allowed to possess alcohol or be in liquored premises. They could not go to pool halls, and so they were really restricted in what they could do. Mobility, and we're going to talk about the act that restricted their mobility. Education, political systems. The highest grades that in most residential schools was grade 8. And so when my father went to residential school, he finished grade 8 and he was sent back to his home. They said, well, you're smart enough now. Political systems, you couldn't run for political office. You couldn't be self-sufficient. So let's say we decide, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to open up a big farm. We're going to sell the meat, and then we're going to do other farming. The government would come and say, you can't be doing this because it's not fair to the other farmers, because you're living on land that we've given you. And so they weren't allowed to do that. So we said, screw this, let's get a lawyer. Well, a lawyer couldn't fight for you in court unless he had permission from the government, or they couldn't talk to you unless they had permission from the government also. So a friend of mine, or a cousin of mine, his mother passed away a couple of years ago, and he found this certificate in her dresser. And Eleanor actually got married in March 25th, 1963. And she received the certificate saying that under the Indian Act, she was no longer status, and which would happen here is she would receive no more benefits from the government, and she would have to leave our community. So when you take a group of people, you tell them they can't get an education, you tell them you can't get a job, you tell them you can't move from that location, then things are tough. When I was a kid, in 1975, we finally got running hot and cold water in our community. And prior to that, everybody had an outhouse. And so life was tough in those communities. And across Canada, we still have 150 communities without running water. First World War happens. The British or the Canadian government aren't going to let Indigenous people fight, but the British government said, no, let them fight. And so they say, okay, they can fight, but they have to be British subjects. So in the First and Second World War, Indigenous people had the highest number as a minority fighting in the First and Second World War. And they also had in some communities, every man goes to fight for Canada. When they return, they don't receive the same benefits. Now they've lost their status because they were enfranchised. So you could be enfranchised if you went to university, you wanted to be a doctor or a preacher. You'd be enfranchised also if you went to war to fight for Canada. They would say you have to be a British subject. Indigenous people are not in British subjects, and so they would lose their status when they came back to their communities. That was a video. So that little video where I was going to show you, it didn't work, was on Pegamagabo. In Francis Pegamagabo, during the war, he was a sniper, and he's from Wasausening First Nation, which is not too far from North Bay. And he had over 300 kills, received so many medals. When he returned from war, they would give your medals at the Legion. And so when he goes to the Legion, he's not allowed to enter the Legion because there was alcohol being served. And so he receives his medals through the back door of the Legion. So in the far north, 1939, the Inuits are dying. And what happens here is prior to the Europeans coming, their currency was whale blubber. So everything they would use the whale for: food, clothing, oils. And when the Europeans come, the Europeans bring money. And then after the fur trade goes downhill, now there is no currency in those communities. And the government said, okay, we'll look after them. They'll be the responsibility of Canada's, and they're Indians also. So under the Act, Indigenous people or Inuits had to wear these identifications. And you can see it says E6, which means Eastern or Western. And the government would come in and say, okay, you all look the same. We're going to start giving you names. So they started to give Indigenous people in the Inuit different names. I heard this lady talk one time, RCMP lady, and she said in our community they had come in, they told us that they were going to give us name. And my father was given 2 weeks to come up with a name. So he said he liked Johnson Outboard Motors, but he also liked Planters Peanuts. So for 2 weeks he was trying to figure out which name he was going to pick. And she says, I'm so glad to tell you my last name is Johnson. In our community, Nipissing First Nation, here a lot of our names are French. Langevez, Levesques, Couchies, Bocaches, and you can see the influence of the French fur traders. And so another officer I met up in Pikanchicum, his last name was Yes No. And so I guess the Indian agents must have come into the community. Did you pick a name yet? Yes, no. And that's how the name that he got was, last name was Yes No. So in 1940s, the South African government was so impressed how Canada had the Indian Act, how they had status Indians, how they had them living in reserves, and some of the apartheid system came after the Canadian system. The High Arctic experiment. What happens here is the government now is afraid that the Russians are coming into the Arctic. And so they take these families from a community and they stick them way far into the north where no one lives. And they made them live there, and a lot of them die. And in 1990, the government apologizing for their act. So the 60s scoop happens. What happens here is the federal government now says the provinces are responsibility for Indigenous people under the Child Welfare Act. And the province starts going into First Nation communities and start taking their children. When I was working at a hospital or teaching at a hospital in Parry Sound, I met a young Mohawk man or an older Mohawk man, and he talked about him and the sisters in the late 60s were taken out of their community and they were both separated at a young age. Another person I met, he was from England, and he had come back, and he said what happened to him. He said when he was adopted out, and they would do that, they would adopt kids across Canada, United States, and even Europe. And he was adopted in Scotland, and he said that's where he ended up in. So self-empowerment. So 1960s, things start to change. I'm not sure if you know who this guy is. Uh, his name is George Armstrong. He's just outside of Sudbury. And he was the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs the last time they won the Stanley Cup in 1867. No, in 1967. And so George actually was, his parents were good friends of my grandparents. And George played all over, was a big star with Toronto Maple Leafs. And as a kid, I'd see him on TV, and I saw him as a role model. And again, was that cultural empowerment that we saw on TV. For George, there was a lot of racism when he played for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He denied that he was Indigenous, and I know his grandchildren now, and they're fighting to get their status back because he denied who they were. So when we talk about treaties and who has treaty rights in Canada, and actually everyone has treaty rights in Canada. When I was talking to a group of police officers in Sudbury last week, I said, you all have treaty rights. For people that live in Sudbury, you're living on the traditional territories, and these traditional territories, because of the treaties, you were able to live here. So everyone has treaty rights. So in 2008, Prime Minister Harper came on national TV and he apologized for the role that Canada had in the residential school systems. So in Canada now, we still have a huge problem with racism. Places like Winnipeg and Thunder Bay and Kenora, huge problems with Indigenous people. And we showed you those little clips at the start from the news. And again, racism is still a huge problem in Canada. This clip was about the trafficking of young girls. Like I said, Indigenous people make up 4% of the population of Canada. The trafficking of women is almost 52% of the Indigenous people. In Canada, we have over 1,300 murdered missing women. And surprisingly, we probably have as many missing and murdered men also. So the residential school system. So we're going to talk about the residential school system, but we're going to talk a little bit about the Indian hospitals.
Do you want to see the video?
Yeah. And we're going to show you a video on that.
On my messy computer. See if I can get it open big. Find my messy computer. It's over here. Let's see.
Very few Canadians are aware of the history of Indian hospitals, which operated from the 1930s to the 1980s. Before Indian hospitals, Indians were not welcome in hospitals except for a few that provided a separate Indian wing, which was usually in the basement. But once the medical professionals started using the term Indian tuberculosis to describe a deadly disease, the segregation of Indians in the medical system got worse, and separate Indian hospitals were established. At first, when First Nations communities heard that they were going to have special hospitals, They thought this was the government's way of taking care of the treaty responsibility for health care. The government told everyone that Indian hospitals were going to keep Canadians safe from exposure to Indian tuberculosis. When the government opened the first 2 Indian hospitals, they realized they could operate for half the cost of other community hospitals, so they decided to expand the Indian hospitals. Some of the Indian hospitals were just unused military barracks that did not have proper kitchens, laundry, and maintenance. Many times there was just one big open space where men, women, and children were all put together with no privacy, and they were overcrowded. The buildings were in need of major repairs, and there was a constant fear of fires. Doctors did not want to work in remote, underfunded hospitals, so the majority of the staff was poorly trained healthcare workers. There were high rates of tuberculosis with First Nation children in residential schools, because of malnutrition, overcrowding, and lack of heat made it the perfect place for the disease to spread. Children who showed signs of the disease were sent to the Indian hospitals, and when they recovered, they were sent back to the residential school. This arrangement meant that both the residential school and Indian hospital could continue operating because they both needed a certain number of people to receive government funds. At the time, Indians were not even considered persons, and they were definitely not considered citizens. Under the Indian Act, it was legal for Indian agents, doctors, and other government agents to apprehend Indians they suspected were contagious with a disease and force them into quarantine. An interesting fact, that part of the Indian Act remains today. Indian hospitals provided a steady supply of subjects that could be used for medical and nutritional experiments. Children were used to test potential vaccines for tuberculosis and subject to electric shock to see that it might be a cure. Patients reported having a lung surgically removed, which meant that their ribs were cut off at their spine. Some of the surgeries happened after the medical system already knew that drugs could cure tuberculosis. Patients were left emotionally and physically damaged for life. In the 1940s and the 1950s, people getting treated for tuberculosis could take medication at home and not have to go into the hospital, but not for Indigenous patients. They were sent to Indian hospitals for years at a time because it was said that they were not capable of their own care at home like non-Indigenous patients. This meant the hospitals could continue to be funded by the government because they had enough patients. Patients were not allowed to leave Indian hospitals for any reason. The Indian Act was amended in 1953 to include the Indian health regulations that made it a crime for Indigenous people to refuse to see a doctor or go to a hospital, and to leave the hospital before being discharged. The RCMP arrested patients and returned them to hospitals or sent them to jail. However, the government would not return those who died at an Indian hospital to their communities unless the family paid the costs. Many were buried at the nearest cemetery in unmarked graves, forever lost to their families. On January 25, 2018, former patients of the Indian hospitals filed a $1.1 billion class action lawsuit against the federal government. They are seeking financial compensation and a formal acknowledgement of the government's negligence in the operation of Indian hospitals.
So why we talk about residential schools and Indian hospitals is that so you have an understanding. And really, we can't change the past, but we can change the future. So this is Spanish, just outside of the community of Spanish. This is where a lot of the people from my community, my father went, lots of my aunts. And this structure still is standing in the community. So residential schools were set up across Canada, and they were, again, to assimilate Indigenous people as quickly as possible. Johnny MacDonald said that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. though he may learn to read and write, he's still a savage. And so we need to take him away from his parents. Duncan Campbell Scott, one of the first deputy ministers, said that we want to get rid of the Indian problem. And again, we want to do this as quickly as possible. He also makes this statement: it's readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools that they die at a much higher rate than in their village. But this does not justify a change of policy which is geared towards the final solution to the Indian problem. So this statement was made in 1909, and somebody else made a similar statement in 1940, and it was the final solution to the Jewish problem. So this is the mush hole in Brantford, and the reason they call it the mush hole, for breakfast they'd eat porridge, for lunch they ate porridge, and for supper they ate the leftovers of lunch and breakfast. So residential schools, the last one closed in 1996, and there was approximately 140 residential schools across Canada. But this does not include the day-run schools, which had a number of deaths also. Children were forced under the Indian Act. So let's say if your parents came or the police came to your house, they could take your children, and if the parents said no, then we could arrest the parents also. Between 1930 and 1940, over 20,000 were enrolled. Even at the height of the residential school, we still have more children in care now, some 80,000 across Canada. 25% never returned home, and actually that's probably around 47%. Saskatchewan had the highest death rate at 69% of the children died from tuberculosis. So this is P.H. Bryce. He's a medical inspector with the Canadian government. In 1909, he wrote a report called, I think it was The Dark History, and he talked about at the residential schools, he said, residential schools is a good place to send your kids if you want them to die. They're underfunded. The children are dying from diseases. They're cold, they're hungry, and they're being sexually molested. And shortly after his report came out, they replaced a lot of the inspectors within the Canadian residential schools. So this was the model that Prime Minister Harper talked about at the residential schools, was to kill the Indian and save the man. So at the residential schools, they were paid on a per diem. It was how many kids they could get into the school and how they would pack the school. If one died, they would go out and replace them, bring them another one from the community and put them into the residential school. A friend of mine travels all over the world, and he went to Alcatraz in San Francisco. And he said he took this picture in the basement of Alcatraz, and it was the Hopi men here actually were sent to Alcatraz because they refused to have their children go to boarding schools also. So this is a picture of handcuffs that they would use in some of the residential schools to take the kids into the schools. So residential schools popped up all across Canada. And when we look at the number the number treaties, they were going westward also. We're clearing the land of Indigenous people because we were afraid that the Americans were going to come into the West. And so residential schools popped all across the West. So they would also do tests on the kids, experiments. They did sterilization to the young girls. They would see how fast your teeth would rot. They would also do different things like on tests on tuberculosis. They were using the kids just as guinea pigs in the residential schools. So this is Paul Martin, the past Prime Minister of Canada. And he goes around talking about the atrocities that were done to Indigenous people at these residential schools. So residential schools popped out all across Canada. And it wasn't just the Roman Catholics, it was the Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterians. And so we had residential schools right across Canada. This next slide shows you the numbers of residential schools in Ontario. So we had one in Fort Albany, Moose Factory, Chapleau, Sault Ste. Marie, Spanish, Wacomican, Brantford, Mount Elgin, Fort Francis, Sioux Lookout, Kenora, and Thunder Bay. So this is Fort Albany. It burnt down and shortly after it closed. This is Wacomico, 1913. And the reason they closed it in 1913 is because they were teaching the kids how to speak the language. They were also building boats in there, so they decided that they needed to take the children away from their families, and they took them out to Spanish, and Spanish was another 2 hours away. This is Spanish where a lot of those children ended up. This is the girls' dorm. There was also a boys' dorm too. This is McTosh. Moose Factory Island. St. Joseph Thunder Bay. This is Kenora. Chapleau, Ontario. And so when I went up to the one in Sault Ste. Marie, Shingwalk, I met the curator there, and he wanted to take me through the residential school. It's now Algoma University. They use it still to teach classrooms in it. And we went out into the gravesite. But before we went out to the gravesite, he said, I want to show you this door here. And when the survivors came a couple of years ago for a reunion, they talked about being put into this door if they didn't want to take part in the sex acts with the priest. And Friday night, they'd stick you in this door and leave you there all weekend. You didn't eat, you just slept in there, and you went to the washroom in there. Shortly after the survivors left, the professor said on Monday I brought a crowbar and we pried that door open, and inside was a small carpet, a coloring book, and some crayons. So this is Mount Elgin. It lasted over 100 years. Kenora. This is Pelican Lake. It's now a high school in the community. In the far north, they would take your children. In the James Bay area, the Hudson Bay Company actually started up a lot of the forts. When the Indigenous people would come out during the summertime, they would stay along the waterways. Fishing, hunting was good. There was a lot of black flies up there, so they would come out where there was water. And so what the Hudson Bay Company did was they set up all these forts along these rivers, the waters that flowed into the Hudson Bay. Then in the 1950s, what they discovered, there was mining up in those areas. And so they set up these residential schools, and they would come and take your children and put them into the residential schools in Fort Albany and Moose Factory. So so they put their kids into the residential school, and at Fort Albany Residential School, they had an electric chair. And so if you got in trouble or you're speaking another language, they put you into the electric chair and give you a shock. The OPP actually did an investigation there. They charged one nun. She would line up the boys outside of her room, 12, 13-year-olds, and invite them one after another to have sex with her. So at the residential schools, it was nothing about schooling. It was more of a cheap labor, a prison. My aunt said when she went to the residential school, they would teach her how to sew. So in the morning, she would pray and then sew and then pray and sew and then pray. The boys would have to play hockey in the winter because the fields were frozen. And they would say they'd play hockey and then pray and hockey and then pray. And it was just abusing those young people at the residential school. So this is the picture of the nun teaching them how to sew. So children were stripped of their culture and their language. So when you went to the residential school, you weren't allowed to speak your language. They would put pins in your tongue, make you eat soap, or they would whip you. And I talked to some of the survivors. They had come to the schools with their regalia on. So their mom would make them beautiful leather things. And when they got there, they would take all the leather things that they had on and they'd throw it into a fire. And you were given a suit, a uniform. and you were given a number. And so when you got to the residential school, they said, okay, you're number so and so. And for the next 8, 9 years, that's how we're going to refer you as. When I meet survivors from residential school, I always ask them what their numbers were, and they all remember what their number was. Children suffered physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse. All kids that came from the residential school suffered from post traumatic stress. Loss of parenting skills. You learn your parenting skills between the ages of 5 and 16. It's what you're teaching your children now is how they're going to be good parents. And at the residential school, the nuns and the priests were teaching the kids about violence, anger, abuse. And when they came back, that's what the parents were teaching back in their own community. Loss of childhood. I asked my aunt, I said, what was the biggest loss at the residential school? She said, my childhood. And I said, what do you mean by that? She said, we didn't go home for stupid things like Easter or Halloween or Christmas or anyone died. We stayed at the residential school. And she said, some kids stayed there all year round. She said, we should have been out playing and having fun. And we lost our childhood. Another lady from Nipissing First Nation, she was taken out of her community at 4 and taken over to Kenora, which is right across Ontario. And she said, I never got to go home for 5 years. And me and my sister finally got to go home. We forgot what our parents looked like. And when we got off the train, we were 9 years old then, and we didn't know who we were looking for. And finally, these two Indigenous people walked over to us and yelled our names, and then we realized it was our parents. So not only did the children suffer, but also the parents suffered by losing their children at the residential schools. This is a picture of a barber chair, and you see the braids on the floor. One of the first things when they got into the residential school, they scrubbed these kids down and they cut off all their hair. In our community now, when you see young men with their braids, it represents those teachings. Longer your hair is more connection to Mother Earth, and it talks about the teachings of how we're supposed to care for ourselves, not only ourselves, but our mothers and our daughters and our sisters. Here's a picture here of the nun cutting the young boy's hair. One of the elders in our community said when she went to Spanish, they would cut all the girls' hair the same, a quarter of an inch above their ears and a half an inch above their collars. At the residential school, they could take children between the ages of 5 and 16. So when you looked at that picture, there was 3 kids that were sitting on the boardwalk. They were probably about 3 and 4 years old. And I'd asked my uncle when he went to the residential school how it was. And he said in the 1920s, he was taken to the train station in North Bay. And he said people were pushing them. It was like chaos. Nobody was taking our name or giving us name tags. And we got on the train and I sat between 2 little boys. And they were probably about 3 and 4 years old. When the priest got on, the train started to move. And the priest came up to us and asked us who we were. They asked the little boys, what's your names? And the little boy said, we don't know. He said, what's your parents' name? And they said, Mom and Dad. And he said, where do you live? And they said, at home. And the priest got upset and he said, oh, never mind. And my uncle said, those little boys stayed as long as he did and they were probably adopted out afterwards. At the residential school, if one person got sick, everyone else got sick. And if one person started to cry, everyone else would start to cry. This is a picture of the boys' dorm in Spanish. And again, there wasn't a lot of privacy in these residential schools. In the far north, they would fly into the communities. So this is a picture near Kenora. A friend of mine went to the residential school. He lived on the Albany River. And he said he knew how to hunt and trap even when he was so young. And he said one time these planes flew into his community. And he remembers holding on to his mom and the priest pulled him off and put him on the plane and took him away. He said, I was stabbed at the first residential school. I was sexually assaulted and molested and sodomized. He said that they put me into another school. Same thing happened to me there. And then I went to to Shingwak, and same thing happened to him there. One of the things that I've noticed when I looked at the class pictures at the residential school was something similar in all of the pictures. And I'm going to show you a few of the pictures of the classes. So one of the things that when I talk to police officers or at the hospitals, they say one thing that we noticed in this picture that there was no spark, there was no smiling, and it was very traumatizing for all of these children at the residential schools. Lost generations. So a couple of years ago, the Canadian government said there was 3,000 children missing, and then they came back and said 6,000. When I went to Shingwak, I talked to the professor there, and he took me out to the gravesite. And I asked him how many children were in this gravesite, and he said we can account for 100. And I said, how many can you not account for? And he said another 100. And I said, so there's 140 residential schools. On the average, how many kids at each residential school can you count or not account for? And he said probably 100 at each residential school. And so that number comes out to about 36,000 children. So a couple of years ago, I met Judge Murray Sinclair, and he talked about the numbers of children at the residential school, and a big surprise to him. And after his talk, I spoke to him and I said, Judge, this is the number that I had. And he said, well, you're right. He said, but you didn't account for kids that were sent home to die, or kids that went missing, or kids that were sent home to die and their parents got sick from what they brought in. And he said, when Canada said 6,000, if you times it by 10, that's probably the number. So the number I came up was 50,000 children will be found. Well, I mean, they won't find some of the kids that had gone out missing. And so the numbers are going to be quite large. So for Indigenous communities, these numbers weren't surprising because a lot of the elders in our community were saying the numbers of death at the residential schools. When I first started to do research on the residential schools, I would hear different stories. One of the stories that I heard was a lady said at the residential school that she went to, they had taken a baby that was born, wrapped it up in a beautiful blanket, and they followed the nun down into the basement, and she threw it into the furnace. And for me, now all of those stories are true. The trauma that these kids went through at the residential school. In 1990, the federal government came back and wanted to apologize. It said, we're going to make all these buildings for you. And then Indigenous people came back and said, you need to look after the survivors. In 2007, they came back and said, okay, we're going to give $10,000 per each survivor. And then the government said, okay, we'll give you $10,000 for just entering the doors of the residential school, and $3,000 for each year that you're there. So some people came back with $28,000, and really $28,000 is not a lot of money. So any questions so far?
I think there's lots in the chat, but I haven't been able to see them because I've been on this side. So if anybody wants to raise their hand, or if anybody on the Nourish team has been looking after this, that would be great to help with questions for George. We can take questions maybe for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to take a little break before we come back.
Hi, Myra. Rachel here calling in from the Nourish team. There's a question from Anne Zai. She asked in the Q&A, when Indigenous people lost their status, what would happen afterwards?
So they would have to move from the community, and especially the women in our communities, they would have to move out. And so let's say back in the 1940s or 1950s or 1960s, when those women moved away, they denied who they were afterwards. And really, it was about looking after themselves because they knew that the government was taking their children away. So they denied who they were. So there's a lot of people now that are trying to find out. They know that they're Indigenous, um, but they have lost that connection to who they were. When women were able to get their status back in 1982 up into 1986, the government didn't just give them their status back, they had to fight to get their status back.
Thank you, George.
You're
We have
welcome.
another question from Marianne Moose. She asks, could you clarify why the residential schools were on the west side of Canada?
Actually, the residential schools went right across Canada. The highest numbers were out west. And again, it was to clear the land of Indigenous people. When you look at the number treaties were going one after another, year after year, and they were trying to. And again, they were afraid the Americans were coming up to steal the land, so they wanted to clear the land and get ownership for them.
I think there's been a lot of thinking, but those are the questions in the chat for now. Oh, sorry, there's one more, excuse me. Also from Anne Zhang. She asks, would it be allowed for Indigenous kids to pursue higher education after grade 8? I think this is in the section before residential schools.
There was actually some residential schools that went higher than grade 8. But like if you wanted to go to university, you lost your status back then. So, and because of a lot of racism, a lot of them stayed back in their own communities.
Okay, there's a long one from Robin here. You can see it at the bottom. She asks, I really appreciated, or she says, I really appreciated what you said about how it wasn't just the bad things that happened to you. It's the good things that did not happen to you. This is very profound. George, can you speak to how the communities who lost their children experienced the policies associated with residential schools and how it affected culture in these communities?
Sure. Well, even communities that didn't lose their children, um, the policies of you couldn't wear your regalia or you didn't learn about your drumming. Now I talk about our communities had lost one generation of songs, one generation of stories, and now we're trying to get those things back. And we're trying to teach our young people, and we should never assume that our children know that. So we're really struggling in our community to get our culture back. Within the last 2 years, we've probably had 10 young people die from drugs and alcohol. So as tragic as all these children that we're finding in our community, we are still struggling big time to find out what is our connection and really help our children to connect. And connection could be our food, our music, our stories. There's so many different connections, and that we need to reconnect our children. So the residential schools took maybe a generation or two away from our communities. When I talk to police officers or teachers or people working in the hospitals, and when you see Indigenous people coming through your doors, not only are you looking at one generation, but you could be looking at 3 generations of people. And one time I was at a high school and I was standing at the front door and I was a police officer and a young guy ran right between me and the principal. And I said, "Who is that little guy?" And he was an Indigenous fella. And she said, "Oh, you probably know his dad. He's a badass." And actually, I knew his grandfather, and his grandfather was a badass. And already we had pigeoned that little guy to become a badass, but he's not. He's going to university this year. He's really a good kid. And again, it's how we support our own communities. And again, what we think is normal may not be normal. And so we're just starting to learn about our own music and our own culture and getting our stories and our language back.
Thank you for sharing that. Myra, do we have room for a few more questions? There's 2 in the chat there.
Yeah, I think we have about 4 minutes, so I think we have at least time for one.
Okay. The next question is from Rona Hanning. They write, "Thank you, George. This is so hard to listen to. They're so important. And I can only imagine the toll in the telling. My question is what you would suggest that non-Indigenous people can do to move from this knowledge to action in ways that can be helpful."
So when I was in Thunder Bay a couple of years ago, and we were talking, and the racism wasn't just in the community; it was in the police service too. And I came back and I talked to the police chief in Sudbury about this, and he said it's just not the culture of the police, but it's at every supper table at night. And now what I tell people to make changes is change that conversation at your supper table, and make that positive ripple effect with your own children. And that even when we plant something, it's amazing when we take a seed and put it outside in the dirt, and we put a little nourishment, a little bit of water, and that plant grows. And so for our communities, it's how do we change the mindset of people? And again, it's through knowledge. And again, it's by the parents really teaching the history of Indigenous people at home um, with our own kids.
I think we have time for one more. Rachel, thank you for doing this. These are great questions.
We have another question from Anzine. They ask, are there any good movie, book, or any other good resources on Indigenous history? They also say, thank you so much, George. I wonder if there would be an online community in which we can stay connected.
So there's actually a lot of good resources now. The video that Myra and I made, Cultural Mindfulness, can be shared with your family. But there's a lot of resources that are out there. Richard Wegamas, who had passed away last year, wrote some great books. Indian Hospital, or was it Indian
Horse?
Indian Horse. He's got a lot of great books. And like one of the things people say, well, how do we change things? I said, well, find out where they're doing ceremonies to the community that's next to you, take part in them. And again, is that history. When I was working with police officers last week, they said, why didn't we ever learn this in school? And I said, because it isn't in school yet. Some of this history isn't in school. And so again, it's upon us to start to learn about the history on our own. And there is a lot of resources. You just have to. There's another book called I Am Not a Number. And that is the story about my dad at the residential school. And the Indian Horse, like I said. And there's another book that Myra has here.
Oh, this one's If I Go Missing. So I can share those resources after too. It's just a few. So thank you for all the questions and thanks for listening this morning. We're just going to take about a 15-minute break. So if we can come back at 1:45, we'll see you then. Sure. Oh.
So at 140 residential schools, 140 had their own cemeteries. So why I showed this picture here, Rosalind Bird, but at the top it says, when a pupil dies at the residential school, the principal is required to inform the Indian agent at once. At a couple of the residential schools, they weren't reporting deaths. And then the government came in and said, okay, you got to restart to report the deaths at the schools. This is a picture up in Kenora. And when I was there, they talked about what would happen if somebody died. The teacher would come in and say, Johnny died last night, so let's get the 5 of you boys at recess, go and bury him. And so that's what happened. We'd go out and bury our classmate. This is a picture out in LeJac, BC. And what happens, these 4 young boys run away from the residential school. They're between ages of 9 and 12. And no one, it's the middle of the winter, no one goes to look for them for 19 hours. And finally, when they do, they find them frozen on the ice. So at the residential schools, with the numbers of cemeteries at the residential schools, the government came out and said in 2008, we're going to look for all the long missing students, and we're going to find them all, and really nothing ever happened with that. So a couple of years ago, I went up to Chapleau, just outside of Timmins, and I heard that there was a gravesite there, and no one from the town of Chapleau knew where it was. And then finally I found out from the OPP where it was. So I went into the bush, and there was a gate, this gate here, it's about 8 feet long, and there's no other gate connected or fence connected to it. It's just in the middle of the bush. And once you walk around this gate, you can see now we're behind the gate, and this is between the highway and the train tracks, and you can see the train tracks at the bottom. And this is where they would bury the kids here in shallow graves. And there's markers on the ground, and what I found out, these markers were put by the First Nation group that lived closest to them, Chapleau Cree. And they put these markers until they can discover where all the kids are, and they put in the creator's hands. So I also went up to Kenora, and you remember the picture I showed you where the 5 boys were burying their friend? This is the side of the hill here. It's larger than a football field, and there's a gate, a fence all around it. And when I was doing a talk at that conference, a lady got up and she said her name was Madeline Skeed. And she said she had gone to the residential school, and her husband had gone to the residential school, and that she had 5 kids, and they took all 5 kids away from her also. And she said her last little boy, they came, the Indian agents came, 2 men. And she said, we live 500 yards away from the residential school. She said, I still live in the same place. And my little boy started to cry, and he cried all the way over to the residential school. She said, I'm 73 years old, and sometimes when I sit in my backyard, I can still hear him crying in the bush. She said, the residential school hired me, and my job was to put kids into coffins, and we would put them into coffins. And we had so many deaths at the residential school, the priest told us we had to double them up. And she said, that's what we do. And she said, so this big field here, we doubled them up. And this field here, after we filled up the other field, we would bury them here also. So this is a picture at Shingwalk in Algoma University. And when you walk into the back of the university, you can see the cemetery, and a lot of the headstones were the priests and the nuns, and very little were of the students that went there. So in some places they'd send a note home, your son died quietly without suffering like a man. We dressed him in his good clothes, and tomorrow we'll bury him the way white people do. So under the Truth and Reconciliation, they said your odds of dying at the residential schools was 1 in 25. Your odds of dying in the war was 1 in 26. So a cousin of mine, Sean Couchie, did this picture. Is about the lost children in the residential school. He also did this picture here. This is my dad. and he was in the book, I'm Not a Number. And in this picture here, Sean, this is the window of the residential school, the boarded up, and then he superimposed my dad's picture there. So when my dad went to the residential school, he was abused. He was beaten up by the priest. He was dying from scarlet fever. And back in those days, if you got scarlet fever, you were going to die. And so my grandparents found out and they took him home. Shortly after that, the Second World War happened and he applied to go to the war. His brothers were all accepted, but he wasn't because his heart was so bad. My father was a very angry man, defeated man, was an alcoholic, and was very abusive to my mother. He really never was an affectionate person, never told us he loved us or never hugged us. He died as a young man at 54. And my brother always told me one time afterwards, the only thing I ever wanted from dad was a hug. Now when I tell my brothers now, I say that my dad was a good teacher. We just do everything opposite that he does. So this is a picture that showed up on Facebook not too long ago. And again, it's about the communities. How do we heal? How do we move forward? I know that there's been a lot of churches burning down out west, and Myra and I were talking about that. And my feeling is we really need to heal as a community. And violence is not part of the seven grandfather teachings that we need. That we really need to find about our culture and our history so our next generation will not suffer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Turtle Island and what it means. So many years ago, in Earth Creation Story, they talked about the turtle and that when North America was covered in ice and water, the turtle came forward and told the creator that people could live on him. So I have my good friend, the turtle here. He's the exact replica of the vacuum cleaner from the Flintstones. And that's a joke. So in our traditional teachings, they say that men and the Nishnabe people were put on it to his back and life began. When you hear the stories of the Haudenosaunee, they talk about that woman falling from the sky world, and as she fell, the geese made a V and put her onto the back of the turtle. And the turtle was used in our communities many years ago as a calendar. So on the back of the turtle, there's 13 platelets, and you can count them. And the 13 platelets represent the full moon in 1 year. And actually the earth, the moon goes around the earth 13 times in one full season. And each moon has a story to it. So the turtle, the last moon that just came up was the strawberry moon. And the strawberry represents that first fruit of the year. The strawberry is called the odeme, which means the heartberry in our community because it's shaped like a heart. You cut it one way, you cut it in down the middle, and you look inside, and there's a little wee heart inside of that. When we use that berry in our celebrations, we leave the green onto it because that's where most of the vitamins are. So there's other stories. There's a sugar moon. It's when the sugars come out of the maple, cedar, and the birch tree. There's a blueberry moon. So it's telling you when it was time to be prepared, when it was time to hunt. On side of the turtle, there's 28 indentations, and the 28 indentations represent the approximate days in between each full moon. So we just saw a full moon not too long ago. So you'd start counting 1, 2, 3, and then by the time you got to 28, you'd have the next full moon. It also talks about our past, where we've come from, what we're doing now, and our future. Sometimes we get stuck too much in the past. We call it depression. And sometimes we worry too much about the future. We call it anxiety. And really, we need to be grounded on what we're doing right now and how we're thinking. And sometimes in our busy lives, we need to spend 15 minutes of the day just listening to ourselves breathe. Especially in this beautiful weather now, I always tell people that they should take their shoes off and reconnect to Mother Earth, walk around on Mother Earth, because there's lots of nutrients, lots of vitamins that grandfather sun puts onto the earth. And so it's helping us to reconnect, which is so important. When the creator first came to the earth, he spoke to all the animals. And he said to the bear, he said to the animals, he said, I have the gift of love, and what should I do with it? The bear, who's big and strong, said, give it to me and I'll hide it in my cave. The eagle said, no, give it to me and I'll fly to the highest mountaintop. There I'll hide it. And the beaver said, no, no, give it to me and I'll swim to the deepest lake and there I'll hide it. And the creator said to them, he said, but when you guys are all gone, somebody will take it and misuse it. The turtle, who's very slow but very wise, said, put it in all men's hearts and only the good will find it. And so those teachings about our creation story, in that every animal plays an important part in our teachings, in our culture, which is so important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the drum, and Myra and I are going to sing a couple of songs. She's saying no, but she's going to. So in our traditional, many years ago in our community here, the Nipissings were, again, in a large area. We were out fighting all the time. And when we were fighting, the women said, okay, enough's enough. And when the men were gone, the women went out and took a hide and put it over top of the base of a tree. And they covered that hide. And when they got back, when the men got back, the women said to the men, sit in this large circle. We're going to put the drum in the middle of the men. And we're going to trade your weapons for these drumsticks. And what we want you to do is we want you to sit at this drum and sing those songs. And the songs talk about life, talk about your family, which are so important. When I was a kid, I'd watch old Western movies like John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. And Indigenous people were always the bad guys. Even when we used to play cowboys and Indians at school, the Indians were always the bad guys. And as an Indigenous person growing up, I was always embarrassed about who I was, because people said we were drunk, lazy, and uneducated. And after a while, some of my friends started to believe that, and they led that life. But now I tell our youth, I say that you're put onto the earth not to look at your feet, that you need to be proud of who you are. And again, learning about those drum teachings. When I started to learn about the drum, it was at Ipperwash. And during the trial, we were sitting in the courtroom and we could hear this drum way out in the parking lot. And the elder that was sitting with me said, that drum shouldn't be here. That's not about violence. That's not about politics. He said, what that drum is all about, he said, in the darkness of your mother's stomach for 9 months, that's what you heard. And he said, when you were born, the doctor took you out, he washed you off, you started to cry, and then your mother put you back onto that heartbeat. And he said, that's what that represents. It's not about violence, it's not about war. And so when the women of our community talked to those men about sitting around that drum, they said, you're going to sit shoulder to shoulder around that big drum. No one's any bigger, no one's any taller. And that we sit together as men. Now, when you go to a powwow, you see all the big men sitting around that drum and they're playing that song. When I first started to learn, I used to see the young women standing behind them. And I said, why do you guys stand here? And they said, we sing as these big men play because we're here to support them. At our high school one time, one of the men said, or young students said to me, oh, one of the girls asked to play the big drum and we told her no, that she couldn't because it was a gift to the men. And I said, no, I said, that drum is a gift from the creator, that everyone's born with that heartbeat. Both men and women can play that drum. the best thing that ever happened to our high school was they went out to Alberta to play with their big drum. And when they got back, they said, George, all the other drum groups out there were mostly women. And we asked them, where are all the men? They said they're not healthy enough to sit at that big drum yet. So we're going to sing a song. It's called Nishnabe Kwe. And Nishnabe Kwe means Nishnabe is who we are and Kwe is woman. So again, we celebrate that life of the women in our community because they are our leaders in our community, and they make all the positive changes in our community, especially in my community when alcohol really devastated our community in the 1960s. It wasn't for the women. They came forward and said, we got to stop drinking and we got to bring our children together. And again, women play that big important role. So Myra's going to play the drum with me. She got her shaker. So this one's called Nishnabe Kwe. So how it goes, I say, hey, na, hey, hey, and then people would repeat that back, hey, na, hey, hey. Then I say, Nishnabe Kwe, hey. Then they repeat that. And then we say that together. And then the last part, we go, hey, 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 we sing it all together. Okay?
Well, I'm just going to invite everybody to take themselves off mute if they would like to sing with us.
Great.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Don't be shy.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Now we sing the last part together. Hey, 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 hey. Nishnabe Kwe, hey. All right, now we're going to sing the next part. It's the same thing, just repeat it again. Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
We sing together? Hey, 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 hey. Nishnabe Kwe, hey. Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, 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 hey. Nishnabe Kwe, hey. So this is where we bring it home. Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Hey, na, hey, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe, hey.
Nishnabe Kwe.
Hey, 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 hey. Nishnabe Kwe, hey. That's the best singing group I've heard so far. So when I went to school, I went to a Catholic school, and they used to compete against other grades, and through singing. So your whole class would get up and sing. And so I remember the nun, the first couple of weeks, she taught us a song, and then she had everybody line up in the front of the class, and we all started singing. And then halfway through the song, she said, "Just a minute." She said, "Georgie, come here." And so I walked down to her, and she was a big, tall nun, and she whispered in my ear, and she said, "Do you like coloring?" And I said, "I love coloring." She said, "Okay, you sit beside me. You don't have to sing no more. You can color for the rest of the year." So I colored the rest of the year. I didn't have to go to the Kiwanis Festival. And then 3 years after that, I sang solo, and I sang in the choir till I was in grade 7. So I look back now, 1 year of coloring sure helped me. So, you want me to talk about two things?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 7 grandfather teachings. And so when I was a kid, we didn't talk too much about the 7 grandfather teachings. We talked about other things. One of them was envy. We were always jealous about each other in our own community. We talk about anger. When I was a kid, there was lots of anger. I was an angry man. My grandfather was an angry man. My grandmother was. My father was. And even with the youth that I meet in the schools, still lots of anger, lots of resentment, and lots of anxiety. When I was a kid, I had lots of anxiety. And they say that people that go through trauma have lots of anxiety. I was afraid of everything. And still today, there's a lot of kids in our community that have lots of anxiety. There was lots of shame when I was a kid. I was afraid people would find out where I lived because both my parents were alcoholics and we were very poor. But it wasn't about my shame. I shouldn't have been carrying it. Lots of guilt, jealousy, and remorse. So now what I tell our kids, what we should be carrying is these 7 grandfather teachings. And the first one is bravery and courage. And bravery and courage is how we stand up for ourselves and how we talk for ourselves and how we really shouldn't put ourselves down, and that we need to be brave enough to open every door that we come to, brave enough to look for those gifts that we've been given in life. They say that the Creator has given us gifts in us, that we're going to do something extraordinary in our lives, better than everyone else's. And you need to be brave enough to stand up for those gifts. And also you need to be brave enough to stand up for other people too. And so bravery and courage is so important. When I was a kid, after my father died, I got into boxing, and the boxing coach used to tell us, it's not how hard you can punch, but it's how hard you can take a punch. If you get knocked down, don't lay down. And when I became a police officer, when I got on the emergency response team, and after we did all the training, the officer came in and said, okay, before you guys go out on the road, just got to tell you is that your chances of being shot out there are much higher. But he said, I want to tell you a story about me. He said, when I got shot as a police officer, the first time I got shot, I thought I was going to die, and I laid there on the roadway, and then they shot me again. And when they shot me the second time, all I could think about was my wife and my kids. And I got up and started to run. And he said, that's what saved my life. So he said, if you get shot out there, don't lay down and die. When things get rough, you got to keep on moving. So the next one is humility, being humble in life. And being humble in life sometimes is not saying anything. Is sometimes you need to listen. And sometimes somebody might come to you or call you and just want to talk. And they're not looking for your great wisdom, but they're just listening, wanting to listen, wanting someone to listen to them. When I was a young policeman, I worked as the strength coach for the North Bay Centennials Junior A team. And I was running through the arena one time, and there was a fellow that was working there, and he said, George, do you have a minute? And I stopped and I said, yeah, sure. He said, can you be charged for suicide? And I said, well, in the 1960s, you could be, but not anymore. I said, why, are you thinking of committing suicide? And he said, yeah, life has been tough for my family, for my health, and my job. I'm not really happy anymore. I said, do you have a plan? He said, well, I was going to go home tonight and kill myself. And we talked for another hour or so, and then finally I convinced him to go and get some help. And now when I go through the arena, I always think, man, imagine if I had run by him and I didn't listen to him. And being a police officer, sometimes when I go into communities after there's been a suicide, people always say, oh, I wish I would have said something, or I wish I would have done something. So don't miss that opportunity. And most of the times it might be somebody in your family. The next grandfather teaching is wisdom. Wisdom comes through us through experiences. And sometimes the worst experience that you have in life comes with the biggest gift. And I always tell people, don't miss that opportunity to learn something when something tragic happens to you. And that sometimes we'll meet people that are wise beyond their years when we listen to their stories. One time I was working at a summer camp for youth, And one of the young boys got up and said, me and my sister are in foster care. Well, we're kind of in foster care, he said. Both my parents were heavily into drugs and we were taken away from them. And my grandfather looked after us for a while. And Children's Aid came and got him from my grandfather because they said he wasn't doing a good enough job. My grandfather felt so bad about that, he committed suicide. And he said, now I'm looking after my sister and I will look after him forever. And he was wise beyond his years. So that wisdom comes through us through experiences in our life. The next one is honesty. Honesty is how we speak. So I always say, speak like the person that you want to listen to. Be careful how you speak because somebody's always listening to you, especially at home. So again, one man's voice or one man's actions can change 7 generations to come. So be that example in your family that talks in an honest way, and be honest with yourself. The next one is truth. Truth is how we walk. So walk like the man you want to follow. So a few years ago, my son and I were out walking through the forest and he was drinking a can of pop. And he finished his pop and then threw it into the bush. I said, now, Robbie, who's going to go pick that up? So after he argued for a few minutes, he brought it home. When he hit 25, he came home one time and said, Dad, I want to tell you a funny story. He said, me and my friend were out walking and he'd finished his can of pop and threw it into the bush. And we walked a few more feet. And I said, now, who's going to pick that up? And I could hear your voice. So again, be careful how we walk or how we're walking at work because people are always watching us. So the last 2 is respect and love. And when I was a young police officer back in the 80s, and we'd go to domestic violence and the complainants or the victims, if they didn't want to lay charges, we couldn't lay charges. And a lot of times when he got there, the man who was beating up his wife would be telling her, I love you, this will never happen again. And in a couple of weeks, it happens again. And so now what I tell our young men, I said, before you can love someone, respect needs to come first. And again, it's how we respect ourselves, how we respect Mother Nature. And again, that respect is so important. The last one is love. And love doesn't cost anything, doesn't weigh anything, but it sure can change a person's life. So as a young officer, I investigated a suicide one time and was a young man, and we had to go and tell his parents. And I remember I told his mom, and his mom was just devastated. When I talked to the father said, I never told my son how much I loved him, but he must have known. And I think now how we should never assume that people know, that we need to share that with our families and our friends, especially with our children. So the 7 grandfather teachings is like building a house. You want to build a great foundation to your life. And so you want to build a great foundation to your own life by using the 7 grandfather teachings. When I talk to our youth, I say, if you're hanging around with 4 idiots, guess who the 5th one is? And so you got to make some good choices. So if you make good choices with the 7 grandfather teachings, I said 5 or 6 years from down the road now, you can't blame anyone for where you are. It's because of the choices that you need to make. So the 7 grandfather teachings, before you can give them out to anyone, you need to give them to yourself first. And then once you give them to yourself first, then you give them to people around you. Your moms, your dads, your friends. So you practice those and then you start to give them to people. So the grandfather teachings are not about emotions, but it's about those choices that we make. And again, if we're going to be successful in life, it's about making those 7 grandfather choices. Miigwech. So we're going to talk a little bit about Chaga. And Chaga is a medicine in our community that comes from the birch, the yellow birch or the white birch. And it's where all the nutrients come into these, it looks like a fungus on a tree. It looks like it's been burnt. They call it a cancer stopper. And we go out in the fall and we collect that off the tree. We only take as much as we need. We don't take the whole piece of chaga off it. It takes about 15 years to grow. Traditionally, we would use it to put in our teas, but you could also make fire with it. I show kids how to make fire with chaga. I can get it smoking within about 30 seconds, and I get a little wee spark within about 2 minutes. And that's how we used to make fire many years ago in our communities, was through this chaga. So we made this short little video with my granddaughter, Faith, and it's about chaga.
Hi, it's George Couchie, Zangani Giwanase, Nipissing Doshaba. And we had gone out into the forest to get some chaga, and Faith has the chaga in her hand here. And now we're going to make chaga tea. So we've cleaned it off. We just kind of washed it off and pulled some of the birch bark off. So there's a couple of ways that you can cook your chaga. Some people ground it down. If you had an old meat grinder, you could put it in there. The best way I find is we use a slow cooker. So we have a slow cooker here, and we're going to put a piece of the chaga into the slow cooker. So this is the piece about the size of a hardball, and we're going to put this into the slow cooker. Yep. And we have the chai tea, and actually just gives it a nice sweet taste to it. And so what we're going to do is we'll add 4 bags of the chai in there also. So can you put those in there? And it's really up to your own taste how many you put in there. And we just put it in there because it has a sweet taste to it, and it's not over bearing on the chai. And then we'll fill it up with water. So we'll fill the slow cooker with about a ½ an inch from the top, and we'll put it in there for 5 hours. We don't want to boil the chai or the chaga. All we want to do is put it into a slow cooker and take the nutrients out of the chaga here. Now, I've been told that you can do this 2 or 3 times with one piece of chaga, and that's what I always do anyways, and when I make my tea. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put some water into the slow cooker, and so we'll just go over to the sink here. What does it look like? It's going to look like tea once it's done. And now what we'll do, once that's filled with water, is we're going to plug it in, and we're going to leave it for 5 hours. So there's a lot of antioxidants in the chaga. They say that blueberries has 100 antioxidants, and they say that the chaga has 800 antioxidants. And so we make it into a tea, and after 5 hours, what we'll do is we'll drain the tea out, the chaga out, and we'll put it into a bottle, and then we'll just put it into the fridge. And every time we want to drink some, we'll take a cup out and drink from that cup. So once that's all completed with the chaga, we've used it 3 times. Then I keep it, and then we'll cut it almost like pie shapes. Then I show people how to make fire with it. So traditionally, this is what they would make fire with it again. They take 2 stones, and we're going to show you how to do that also. Hi, it's George Couchie. Hi, it's George Couchie. Zangari Giwanaset.
There. All right. Thanks, George. Is there anything more that you'd like to say about that? I think it's just so funny. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. I crack up every time I see that, so it's hard not to laugh out loud because we weren't on mute. So thanks for watching. I'm just going to go through a little bit of more slides about the food as our medicine, and then we're going to open it up for a discussion, more questions. I hope people aren't shy to talk. Just feel free to ask any questions right now. This is supposed to be a space for learning, so hopefully people will have questions in a second. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the food as our medicine, what's available for participants. There's some beautiful posters here that were created by Mariah Mwagasi and Brightweb and Rally. So they're available on our website, and you can print them off and put them in your organization, or you can email me and I can send you some as well. We also have these awesome social shares. So you can share them as well with your colleagues on your social media. And then it's also available, the learning journey is available in a PDF form. So it's also on our website, but you can also download each season in a PDF. So you can have them for your offices or share them that way as well. And these are the worksheets that come with your learning journey. So when you finish each season, there's some reflection questions for you, and then you can submit them. And then there's 2 gifts that we have. Right now, for the first 200 learners that complete, there is a beautiful beaded pin that's been created by Brittany Gauthier, who is I've known for quite a while, and she's from Nipissing First Nation. I always stumble on that word. So we've gifted 3 already, so there's 197 left. And then all learners will also receive this beautiful certificate. And for today, we didn't announce this until now, but we also have a certificate for today. So there is a form that you can fill out, and we will send you a PDF certificate for today. For next steps, you can complete your learning journey or share it if you've already completed it. And if you can mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will be in the fall, Seeing the Path, and it'll be based around the harvest with corn as medicine. And that concludes our formal presentation for today. So we're going to open it up for discussion. Feel free to stick around, and if you don't have any questions or you don't want to, then please go ahead and continue on your day. But I want to thank George for everything today, and the Nourish team for helping, and for everyone for attending. So if you'd like to put your screens back on or ask any questions, then feel free to just chime in. Stop sharing. We can just do the Georgia Meyer show too.
Yeah, sure.
I think I hear somebody unmuting.
Yeah, hi. I don't have a specific question, but I just want to thank you so much. It was a phenomenal presentation, and you've given us so much to think about. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Miigwech.
Hi, George. It's Robin here from the Nourish team. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got chickens in the background, so hopefully they're not drowning out my question. But I would love, I mean, I think So thank you so much for your time today and for sharing these important stories and this learning with us and helping everyone that joined today's call to kind of continue on their own personal growth and learning journeys. I know that you've done many of these sessions, and for you, somebody I think commented earlier about how the telling of these stories must be very difficult and emotional for you as well. And it all takes a toll every time you share it. And I'm just wondering if you can share with us some of what you've learned through the process of offering the cultural mindfulness sessions with different audiences and how that has, supported your own growth and journey, and any sort of, I guess, wisdom or insights from doing that over time, over many years, that, would benefit us kind of hearing about that process for you and some of what you've heard back from people as you share this.
Thanks, Robin. When I was in Sudbury last week, I was talking about one of the officers had left the police service, an Indigenous officer, and I guess got burnt out. And sometimes teaching and healing at the same time is quite tough. And that when we talk about these things over and over again, it doesn't get any easier. But it's so important that we do talk about the history and the culture, that it helps people to have an understanding, especially our youth. Again, it's so important that our young people learn. So for me, doing it over and over again, I mean, there's some parts that I get emotional with, but for me, it's more of a healing now that I see it's a good thing. And crying in our community is a show of strength, that we're able to release those emotions. We were at a funeral a couple of weeks ago, and the person said there, like, if you keep it all in, you're going to get sick. But you don't want to cry, and you keep it in, it's going to make you sick. But if you let it out, it doesn't make you sick. So again, for our community, it's all about healing now, not about anger or violence. And again, it's through the teachings and sharing with people. It's part of the truth and reconciliation also.
Marie Claude says, I just want to say I'm very grateful, Miigwech, for sharing this with us. And Brenda Murray says, thank you for this enlightening presentation today. Merci beaucoup. Leanne Holland says, thanks for offering your time today, much appreciated.
So one of the things too, we kind of shortened down the talk. Usually the history is about a 4-hour talk, and the residential school is about a 4-hour talk. But Myra said you guys are a lot smarter than that, so that's why we shortened it down to 3 hours. With the police last week, it was a 2-day training.
I also asked to have it shortened because I thought that we could talk more too. So if people are feeling shy, that's totally understandable, but no question is a bad question. And if there's anything that's on your mind, or if there's anything you would like to share, please do so. We were at a couple presentations on last week, and the feedback was that they wish there was more time for questions and discussion. So we listened to feedback. So we're just hoping that people can join in a conversation. But if not, maybe we'll just start talking.
One of the things when I talk to police or people is, people are always worried about saying something stupid. There is no stupid questions. I've worked with the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, for years. They've asked all the stupid questions, so you're not going to surprise me.
There's one here. I'm joined today from, it's from Emily Zamora. I'm joining today from a device without a camera or a mic, but I would like to thank you for the excellent presentation of knowledge and lived experience. I've signed up for the Nourish Food as Our Medicine learning journey, but have yet to begin the journey. Do you have other resources or suggestions for learning more about traditional foods and medicines like the chaga? So interesting and well presented. Thank you again. George probably has lots of resources that we can share, but we'll put a list together. And then we also have our digital resource bundle that's on the Nourish website. It has about 150 resources right now, and we're going to be adding more to it as time goes on, but we'll put together a list as well. Is there anything specifically that you like to share?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. Here's another question. Can the longer training be accessed anywhere? I've taken several cultural safety and Indigenous history short courses, but today's talk stands out.
Well, thanks. I'm not quite sure how that, I know that like the police will ask me to come and I'll do a 2-day talk. And I think it was the University of Alberta has a free Indigenous course that you can sign up for free. All you'd have to pay is, if you want a certificate, it's $60. And I think it was the University of Alberta, but we'll find out for sure and we can put that up.
But if someone wanted to host you for a couple of days with that, how would that work?
I have a website called Cultural Mindfulness, and I just wanted to say a little thing on that. You know, sometimes they call it cultural safety or cultural. What's the other one?
Awareness, cultural training.
Yeah,
there's a whole bunch of different.
So the reason we called it cultural mindfulness, because we want you to be mindful not only about the history, but how your life might change somebody else's life, or how we have an understanding for Indigenous people. And so that's why we called it cultural mindfulness. And so with my training, people will ask me to come and speak, and I go to hospitals and police stations and teachers, and I do it's usually a 2-day talk.
From Alana Sharon, one of my sites is right next door to where a residential house was. It has really vibrated to my very essence. I agree change will take place one person at a time, and speaking up whenever we see judgment based on behaviors. A learning journey for healthcare hopefully will begin in light of recent events. Amy Harrison says, drinking chaga right now and very proudly wearing my food is our medicine pin. Such valuable learning, thank you. Emily Zamora, excellent reading for my next mat leave. Thank you very much. Rachel shared the resource library in the chat. Meyer, do you have a favorite Bannock recipe you could share with us? Yeah, we could definitely find one for you. Laura shared the U Alberta learning. George's website is shared in the chat as well. Competence, not that you can be competent in a culture.
That's the word I was looking for.
Oh, okay.
and that's one of the things I always hear, that's competent. And, you know, like even all the information that I have, I'm never going to be competent. And especially when we talk about the history and things like that, like if someone's looking for all the answers from me, I don't have all the answers because there are different nations of people, different groups. So thanks very much for that comment.
I'm halfway through the U of A course. It is excellent. It can be accessed through Coursera for free as well. And there is a question in the question. Oh, there it is. Great. Where and which provinces do you speak with police?
Mostly Ontario and Quebec.
All right.
Hi there, this is Rachel calling in from Montreal. I work with the Nourish team. Deep gratitude for your sharing today, George, and thank you for putting this together, Meyer. There's a lot of folks joining us today from the healthcare sector, from different parts of it, whether they're dietitians or doctors or administrators. I was wondering, George, from your trainings with the healthcare sector, are there specific blind spots, or are there specific bright spots, like places of potential that you see for those working in health? I imagine each industry has their own kind of way of thinking. Thank you.
I can tell you it's better teaching the healthcare than it is working with police officers. Police officers have a kind of a different attitude. They're more welcoming. Like when I went into the hospitals in the northern part of Ontario here, they were excited that I was there. They were looking for so much information. They're more willing, I think, than a lot of other groups of the healthcare. But I just remind them all the time when people come into your hospitals, again, like you're not looking at one generation, but you could be looking at 3 generations of people that are coming through there. And again, the trauma that some of these community members are coming in with. And especially for Indigenous people, is we need to understand the trauma that we're carrying. When I talk to our youth, I always say that all of us have scars, and we have to understand what our scars is, so we're not repeating into the next generation or passing them down to the next generation. So for me, both my parents were alcoholics. So one of the things that I decided when I was probably in grade 3 or grade 4 that I was never going to drink, never take any drugs, and I've done that all my life, and just from what I learned from them. So again, it's passing that information down to our youth, so we're not doing the same thing, and for hospitals to have an understanding of those people that are coming through their doors. And it's just not Indigenous people, but it's really how we treat everyone.
Did you want to do a close?
Sure. What we could do is do a closing prayer. So we thank the Creator for this beautiful day. The sun has come out today. We call that Grandfather's Sun. We ask Grandfather's Sun to look after us in our own journey, and to look after people in our communities or our families that are sick, that are struggling. We ask the Creator to help them. And we also ask the Creator to look after the Indigenous communities and to help them in their journey to become healthy and to start the healing. And we say miigwech. Miigwech. Thank you.
Miigwech, everybody.